listener production.
Hi, Helen Smith here with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Distraction politics is a common tactic used by everyone from our world leaders down to our local MPs in an attempt to, distract us from bigger issues going on or have us see something through rose-coloured glasses.
The problem is when it becomes manipulative and it really is a cynical attempt to obfuscate, to hide information from the public, to lie effectively. That's where you're really starting to cross an ethical line.
So where and when have we seen it? Think climate change, sporting grand finals, and more recently, Trump, with Democrats calling his DC police takeover a distraction from Epstein and tariffs. That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Tara Cassidy. It's Wednesday, the 13th of August.
Hey Helen, and to you listening, we're starting this morning in the ACT, where former Deputy Opposition Leader Julie Bishop has been labelled an arrogant, hostile bully at a Senate inquiry looking into the governance, transparency and financial accountability of Australia's universities. Julie Bishop is now the Chancellor of Australian National University in Canberra, which has been accused of having a toxic culture inclusive of harassment, intimidation and threatening behaviour towards staff. In an emotional testimony, ANU academic Liz Allen told the inquiry's committee that the behaviour toward her became so severe she contemplated taking her life.
I was bullied into near suicide. I miscarried a much-wanted baby. I've lost the opportunity of a promotion. I fear for my job, and my career has been derailed.
Dr. Allen says at times Julie Bishop would exclude her from meetings, accused her of illegal activities to do with leaking confidential documents, which she denies, and of defaming the university's council. According to the demographer, on one occasion, Chancellor Bishop laughed at her when she tried to defend herself and began to cry and hyperventilate, leaving her feeling deeply humiliated, violated and traumatised. ANU's CCO has also fronted the inquiry, saying the uni takes the allegations seriously, but on an initial review, he claims some don't appear to be correct. However, that ANU is looking into all assertions with grievance proceedings currently underway. In a statement, Ms. Bishop says she rejects the allegations made about her and claims she only ever acted with respect, courtesy and civility.
Google and Apple have lost a landmark case after the federal court ruled they engaged in anti-competitive conduct, including in two cases brought on by Epic Games, the developer of popular game Fortnite. It comes after Fortnite was kicked off the Google and Apple app stores in 2020 after Epic Games offered its own in-app payment system that bypassed the one used by the tech giants, cutting out the fees Apple and Google receive for in-app payments. Judge Jonathan Beach found both companies broke the law by misusing their market power, including with restrictions they put on their app stores and by failing to allow competitors to have those in-app payment options.
So in the Australian cases, Epic Games alleges Apple's control over its in-app purchases prevented users from downloading apps outside its store and prevented developers from running their own. So basically, app developers were forced to use the tech giant's payment platforms where both companies would collect between 15 and 30% of sales revenue in fees. But overall, the landmark ruling now clears the way for two class actions covering 15 million Australian consumers and 150,000 developers who could push for substantial compensation over the price and commissions they paid for the apps. Consumer advocates and class action lawyers say it could change how digital platforms operate in Australia and may result in lower prices, increased competition and more innovation.
Western Australia is introducing a long-awaited bill set to modernise the state's surrogacy and IVF laws, making them more inclusive and coming 8 years after it first promised reform. WA is currently the only state that doesn't allow same-sex couples, single men, transgender and intersex people to access surrogacy, which is currently limited to heterosexual couples and single women. Now, the state's Premier Roger Cook says the bill will streamline and modernise WA Australia's assisted reproductive laws and bring the state into line with the rest of Australia. And he does acknowledge that it's taken much longer than first thought and that the state wanted to make sure the legislation was right.
The changes would also remove the requirement for people to demonstrate medical infertility to access assisted reproductive technology. And for same-sex couples, it would also recognise both as parents of a child born through surrogacy. Advocates for the new changes include Paul Hadfield-Jai, who called WA's laws barbaric and cruel. He says they forced him and his husband to go to the US and have their 2 children, which is costly and risky, but it also is because people had no other options. However, the WA Premier says MPs would be allowed a conscience vote on the contentious issue, making sure they understand it but don't unnecessarily delay it. Now, surrogacy is a very complex process, and Listener's investigative team have done a whole series on this industry, exploring everything from egg and sperm donation surrogacy, sourcing sperm on Facebook, to finding out you might have 700 siblings. So that's called Secrets We Keep by Any Means, and we'll pop a link in our show notes for that one.
1 in 5 Aussies live with a common parasite, often spread by cats, which can affect our reaction times and lead to poorer mental health. According to researchers from the Uni of Melbourne, toxoplasmosis is often found in raw meat or feline faeces from those that have eaten a mouse, with the World Health Organization dubbing it one of the most neglected parasitic infections. It's been linked to increased risk-taking behaviour, including drug taking, drinking, difficulty holding down a job, and a higher chance of being involved in a car crash. And that's because, while the parasite doesn't cause serious health issues, researchers say that those who have it are more likely to be anxious, depressed, or suffer from other mental health issues, and that it impacts a person's dopamine levels, their patience, and self-control.
The bad news, well, there's no cure for it, but the good news, the research teams created a better way to detect it using an online test, which assesses people's reaction times and attention span, which they say is 97% accurate. And they know because they've checked the results against blood tests. So apparently those at risk are people with weak immune systems, who have HIV or are pregnant, because it can seriously affect a baby. And if you want to avoid it, wash your hands after changing your cat's kitty litter and don't eat raw meat.
Never fear, Freddo to the rescue!
Freddo's fantastic!
Well, it turns out Freddo's might not be so fantastic anymore. The daughter of Freddo's creator says her dad would be rolling in his grave, Helen, if he saw the beloved Chocky Bar today. According to Leonie Waden, before he died, her dad, Harry Melbourne, was disgusted with how small the chocolate had become, with it shrinking even further in size since then, and also at how much people were being charged by Cadbury and the retailers for it, as you could once buy it for a penny. And she says she actually hasn't bought a Freddo since her dad died because of it. What do you think, Helen? I checked online and even just on Woolies, one Freddo will set you back $2, or you can get a bag of 18 for $7. Is that fair or a rip-off?
Yeah, look, bit of a rip-off. I think she's hit the nail on the head, because we talk about shrinkflation all the time with a variety of products and chocolates in particular. So it's sad to see corporates always charging more for less. But look, to lighten the mood a little bit, a cute backstory about Freddo's for you. Apparently, Harry Melbourne, who's an Aussie, by the way, named the Freddo in honour of his best mate, Fred. Aww. And it was apparently meant to be a mouse, but Harry convinced the boss's mind, saying a frog would be better because kids are scared of mice and they also might like to go down to the lake to catch tadpoles. So the Freddo was first produced in 1930 out of Fitzroy in Melbourne.
Oh, I do love that. And I think moral of the story, leave our Chocky Bars alone, big companies. Now, that brings our headlines to a close for today. Coming up next is your deep dive, Helen, looking into distraction politics and how those in charge often get us to look over here when they don't want us to look over there. Have a listen to that up next.
Political spin doctors are the masters of distraction politics that ultimately influence our news cycle. And you don't have to look too far to find it. Think about when the government might drop a report during a big grand final, or when climate experts warn us that we aren't going to hit our 2030 emissions target while politicians spruik power bills. Some common tactics include flying under the radar, pivoting, and of course, the truth but not the whole truth. There's even been studies that found US President Donald Trump's tweets were successfully distracting the media away from topics that were potentially harmful to him. For example, when COVID-19 failed to just go away, he instead controlled the narrative by tweeting about the Obamagate conspiracy theory. Now, putting spin on a story is common and a smart move by politicians trying to win your vote. But what happens when the lines are blurred and spin turns into outright lies? Caroline Fisher is a former spin doctor and media advisor to Labor's Anna Bligh, a former Queensland Premier, and is an adjunct professor from the University of Canberra. Caroline, how would you describe distraction politics?
Distraction politics is a spin tactic used to divert the audience's attention away from things that politicians don't want the public, to be scrutinising them on.
And you were a spin doctor. You've called yourself that. What are some of the key tactics used to create distraction politics?
So there are kind of two main types of distraction politics. So there's one is actually creating a distraction to divert people's attention, or there's using the cover of another event, a major event, to maybe release damaging information or something like that. And there's a classic example of that. During the 9/11 attacks, in the UK under the Blair government, one of the press secretaries there, she sent out an email saying, now it's a very good time to release anything that we want to normally bury, such as councillors' expenses. There'd been a scandal around councillors' expenses. And so this, of course, caused real alarm that, that this type of covert tactic was being used to hide bad news.
Some other tactics that you've written about is the leak, and there's also pivoting. There's also the truth, but not the whole truth. Is this just good PR that politicians do?
Yes and no. I think there's ways and ways of doing things. In some ways it's just normal human behaviour. You'll tell the least damaging part of the truth. You might go and... No one wants to present themselves in a really bad light. So we're always going to put our best foot forward. In that sense, spin is a very kind of natural and human thing to do. And of course, if you're a business or a politician, you're hardly going to go out there and say, look, I really failed at this and therefore you should not elect me. No one is going to do that. But politics is hard. It's complicated. It's never black and white. And so obviously politicians will do their best to try and look like they are acting on issues of concern to the public in a positive way. It is completely normal PR in many ways. The problem is when it becomes manipulative, and it really is a cynical attempt to obfuscate, to hide information from the public, to lie effectively. That's where you're really starting to cross an ethical line. I think most people and members of the public are literate enough to understand that politicians are normally just trying to put, to gild the lily effectively, to put the best foot forward. But when we're going into actual lies, which we see a lot of in the United States, then it's a whole other ballgame. And yes, I think that really crosses the ethical line.
I'll get into some of what we're saying about Trump in a little bit, but I want to ask, how would we see these distraction politics play out? Is it setting up a press conference or a meeting or sending out a PR release to journalists? What's the process?
Those sorts of things, like sending out a press release to alert the media to an issue that the politician wants covered, that is standard PR practice. And what we would call that sort of, overt tactics, they're just normal. Staging an event, holding a press conference, putting out a press release, conducting a speech. Completely, there's nothing wrong with those things. The issue about ethics comes into that is, are they doing that in order to distract your attention from something else? What's the other thing they're trying to distract you from? So it's about the motivation for why they're doing something ultimately. That's where it becomes tricky.
And how can we tell if they're doing that?
So journalists and political reporters, hopefully they've got some kind of beat, and they are kind of attached to shadow certain politicians in their portfolios, and they have good range of contacts in those areas. And we will see from time to time, reports like, the government is sitting on a report. It's not releasing it, for instance. And then, that will put pressure on the government to have to release that. So it really is about the efforts of the journalists and the resources of journalism to really be on top of their area and to have great contacts who can, point them in areas that are being ignored or hidden, reports not being released, findings not being acted upon, etc. Also, one of the other classic tactics is to release something late. So, they'll put it out, late on a Friday night when all the journalists are out drinking, knowing that no one's paying attention. Or, under the cover of the rugby league grand final or something like that, where they think, the nation's not paying attention. Journalists know that this is a standard tactic, so you do have to pay attention. And if it's a major event, like a terror attack or a major flood crisis or something, and you think, okay, if we try to focus on this now, it's just not going to get the attention that it really deserves and the scrutiny it really deserves. We're going to come back to this, but make sure you do come back to it. It's about resourcing of journalism in the end.
And recently we've seen some great examples of distraction politics coming out of the US and Trump with the Epstein files. For example, he just announced that the National Guard is going to be deployed to rescue Washington, D.C. from crime, despite a 30-year low. This is at the same time as a judge has rejected Trump's administration's bid to unseal Ghislaine Maxwell's grand jury transcripts. Do these tactics work?
Well, they will temporarily, because these issues are big enough to divert attention. Like the fact that he is doing this in Washington is a major policy and civic issue, and so it does deserve scrutiny. So it will temporarily divert attention. But it's very overt, it's very obvious what he's trying to do. Temporarily, there will be a shift in focus. But what's really important is that we discuss that this is the tactic that he is using. So that the public becomes literate about these sorts of tactics. And news organisations need to come back to these other issues that he's trying to, distract attention from.
Can you give me some examples of distraction politics here in Australia?
One of the other, classic examples, and we see it every year, is with the federal budget, for instance. So they leak very specific positive stories out of the budget, or negative things that they want to get out of the way that won't ruin the story on the day. They've got their narrative set about what they want journalists and the audience to focus on about the budget they're delivering. That really does steer the agenda, and it is also a form of distraction. And I think the thing that is important here is that you need to be really careful and pay attention to the types of stories that they are leaking and to whom. Very often, strategically, you think as a media advisor, oh, well, I'm going to leak this story or give this story in exchange for no scrutiny, which is, appalling. But I'm going to give this story to a particular journalist because I think that they're favourable. They're going to give me favourable coverage. Well, that in itself is really problematic. And there are certain journalists, of course, that they won't give stuff to because they think that they're not as trustworthy or that they're not going to give them a free kick effectively. So all of these things are being thought about all the time in political offices about who they release information to and when.
And how does the media play into distraction politics? You talked about there, potentially people are going to specific journalists that they know will give them a free kick or listen to, hey, you can't ask these questions, so they won't do it. How important is that role that the media plays?
It's so important, and it's even more important now with social media and other forms of digital media because politicians can now go directly to the public. Okay, so there's no filter, and we see this with Trump all the time, but every politician does it, right? That whether it's a TikTok video or a tweet on X or whatever. So that effectively removes the filter of journalists who traditionally within democracy are seen as the fourth estate, are the gatekeepers who would normally scrutinise and vet information before releasing it to the public, right, in their stories. That's kind of gone. Whenever journalists do get the chance to write about politics and to analyse it and really pick it apart, their critique is more important than ever. And the thing that happens, particularly on social media, and again, coming back to President Trump, they talk about flooding the zone with shit, effectively. So like he puts out so much stuff, right, and so much disinformation that it's really hard for journalists to sift through what's important. Which one of these lies should I focus on today? Because there's so many. So it's a deliberate tactic to get as much information out there as possible, which makes it much harder for journalists to make really incisive choices about what's really important for the public to know, because you can't publish everything.
So how can consumers be better at spotting distraction politics?
Well, I think just to really understand, if, for instance, whenever there is a major event, like the football grand final, like a royal visit, a major flood or whatever, just have a look at whatever news is buried at the bottom of the page. Do pay attention to issues that are being released, particularly if you're following politicians or other groups on social media, just to have a look at what information they are eking out at these times when major events are happening. It kind of behoves all of us to really try and stay across what's going on. It's time consuming, but being an active citizen, requires us to be well informed. And so we've all got to put our shoulder to the wheel.
Caroline, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
My absolute pleasure.
That was Caroline Fisher, a former spin doctor and an adjunct professor with the University of Canberra. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone else you think might enjoy it. It's one of the easiest ways you can support everything we do here at The Briefing. And you can check out our Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Helen Smith. Catch you next time.
Listener.